My name is Nadia Mitchell, and this morning, while I was ironing the crease of my crimson gown, my phone lit up with a message from my mother. "We're too busy helping your sister move," it said, followed by a cheerful emoji as if that softened the sting. I stared at it for a moment, feeling that familiar quiet settle over me, the kind that comes from realizing you've been placed second once again, and then I typed back two simple words. "That's okay." No sarcasm. No guilt trip. Just calm. Because what they didn't know was that in less than 2 hours, I would be standing on the stage of Memorial Auditorium receiving the President's Award, the highest honor Stanford gives for service and innovation. When the lights dimmed and my name Nadia Mitchell glowed across the giant LED screen, the entire hall rose in applause. Except for 2 seats in the front row, still empty, ribbons of cardinal red untouched by the spotlight. By the time the ceremony ended, my phone was vibrating nonstop, relatives calling to ask why my parents weren't there, reporters searching for a quote about the missing family. I didn't answer. I just looked at those empty chairs and thought of all the years that had led to this one quiet truth. Have you ever been overlooked by your own family until your success made them realize what they'd lost? Tell me where you're watching from. I grew up in a small town in Oregon where life moved slowly and everyone knew which family sat where in church on Sundays. The Trans were the kind of family people nodded to with polite approval. My father, Thomas, an accountant who wore the same brown shoes for 20 years. My mother, Claire, who led the women's choir. And my little sister, Sophie, who seemed to radiate the kind of light that people couldn't help but turn toward. Everywhere we went, it was always, "Oh, you must be Sophie's sister." That was my introduction, my role, my permanent label. I learned early that being second wasn't a punishment, it was just how the world had arranged itself. Sophie was sunshine, all laughter and ribbons, the kind of girl who was born to be adored. I was the shadow that made her brightness possible, the one who remembered to bring her water bottle to recitals and stayed up late finishing the school projects she forgot about. When I was 10, I realized for the first time how invisible I had become. My birthday fell in early May, right when my parents were busy redecorating Sophie's room. She was 8 then, and Mom decided she was growing up so fast and deserved a space of her own. The living room was filled with boxes from the local moving expo, bright pink banners, and a cake that read, "Congratulations, Sophie," in thick white frosting. I remember standing beside it, smiling for pictures that weren't meant for me, the cheap camera flash washing out my face. When I pointed out that it was also my birthday, Mom paused for half a second before saying, "Oh honey, we can celebrate yours next weekend. Right now, let's not confuse things." So I clapped for Sophie with everyone else and sang along as she blew out candles on a cake that should have been mine. Later that evening, when the guests had gone home and the confetti was swept away, I found a small gift bag on the kitchen table with my name scribbled wrong, Isabel, on the tag. Inside was a notebook with the logo of Northwest Moving Expo printed across the cover. It was one of those free giveaways my father used to collect at work conferences. The paper inside smelled faintly of cardboard and printer ink. For a moment, I just stared at it, unsure whether to laugh or cry. It wasn't a gift so much as a reminder that even my name didn't quite belong anywhere. Still, I took it to my room, sat by the window, and opened to the first page. The lines were blank, the kind of blank that dares you to fill it. I picked up a pencil and began to write nothing grand, just words about the day, about the pink balloons, about how the candles smelled like sugar and wax and disappointment. That night, without realizing it, I started doing something that would later save me. I began writing my own story. Sophie's room became the house's new centerpiece. Every neighbor who visited got a tour. Can you believe she chose the colors herself? Mom would beam, showing off the lavender curtains and the golden lettering above the bed that said, "Sophie's Space." I watched from the doorway, holding the notebook close to my chest. When Mom saw me, she smiled in that absent, distracted way and said, "Nadia, sweetheart, could you bring Sophie some lemonade?" So I did. That was how most of my childhood felt, like walking in and out of other people's celebrations, carrying trays they forgot they'd asked for. At school, it wasn't much different. Teachers adored Sophie before she even arrived in their classrooms. "Oh, you're Sophie's sister? She's such a delight," they'd say, expecting me to mirror her charm. I never did. I was the quiet one, the girl who read under trees during recess, who fixed the projector when it jammed, who didn't complain when paired for group projects with kids who never did their part. If someone noticed me, it was usually because something needed fixing. If someone praised me, it was because I'd made things easier for someone else. But inside the margins of that moving expo notebook, I found a kind of refuge. Every night before bed, I'd write about things I couldn't say aloud: the way the house fell silent after Sophie's laughter faded down the hall, the way Mom's compliments to her felt like tiny paper cuts to me, the way I wanted, just once, to be the one people noticed first. Writing didn't change anything outside my room, but it made the silence less heavy. I learned that words could be a place to live when no other space belonged to you. The word moving kept showing up in those early pages. It fascinated me the way it could mean progress for some and loss for others. Sophie was always the one moving forward. New dance classes, new trophies, new friends. I was the one who stayed behind, packing the boxes, labeling the lids, making sure nothing got lost in the shuffle. Even as a child, I understood that moving wasn't just about changing rooms or addresses. It was about being chosen to begin again while someone else stayed behind to clean up. Looking back, I think that birthday was the first time I understood what it meant to be unseen. But it was also the day I began to build something invisible of my own. That cheap notebook, with its flimsy cover and crooked pages, became my secret world, a place where I didn't have to compete for space. Each word I wrote was a tiny rebellion, proof that even if no one else remembered my name, I did. And someday, I promised myself, the world would too. The first time I truly understood what it meant to stand alone was during the county science fair in 7th grade. I had spent weeks in the garage after school, hunched over a table covered in wires and scrap metal, building a small wind turbine from parts I scavenged at the local junkyard. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. I remember the soft whir of the blades catching even the faintest breeze, the hum of energy that felt like possibility itself. Every evening I'd run into the house, excited to show anyone what I'd built. But Mom was usually on the phone organizing costumes for Sophie's dance troupe, and Dad would murmur, "That's nice, honey," without looking up from his laptop. So I learned not to expect applause. The day of the fair arrived on a rare sunny Saturday in early March. The gym at Jefferson Middle School was buzzing with chatter and the metallic scent of fresh paint. Posters lined the walls, each more colorful than the next volcanoes erupting, solar systems spinning, the occasional nervous parent whispering advice to their child. I stood by my project, hands trembling slightly as I adjusted the little silver blades. I kept glancing toward the entrance, half expecting to see my parents walk in, maybe holding the camera Dad always brought to Sophie's recitals. The event had started only an hour earlier. I told myself they'd probably come later, after her rehearsal. When the judges made their rounds, I spoke clearly and carefully, explaining how the turbine could generate enough energy to power a small lamp. They smiled, asked a few questions, and moved on. By the time they announced the winners, the afternoon sun was already slanting through the high windows, turning the polished floor into long streaks of gold. I wasn't even listening when they said my name. First place, Nadia Mitchell. There was a brief cheer from the audience, then scattered applause. I froze for a second, unsure they'd said it right. When I walked up to the stage, I turned toward the row of folding chairs where families sat with their cameras ready. The seats marked Mitchell family were empty. I smiled anyway, because that's what you do when you win and no one's there to see it. The principal handed me a small trophy shaped like a light bulb, its base engraved with my name. The flash of a stranger's camera went off, a parent from another school, documenting the winners. The light was so bright it almost hurt. Somewhere in that moment, I realized that being visible didn't always mean being seen. After the ceremony, I lingered near the entrance, clutching the trophy against my chest as the crowd thinned. Sophie's best friend, Lily, waved goodbye to me on her way out with her parents. "Congratulations," she called. I nodded, pretending the lump in my throat was pride. I kept waiting for Mom's car to appear, for Dad's familiar honk from the parking lot. It never came. By the time I walked home, the sun had dipped below the hills, painting the sky a dull orange. I found Mom in the living room, pinning sequins onto Sophie's new costume while Sophie twirled in front of the mirror. The whole room sparkled with the reflection of gold thread. "How was the fair?" Mom asked without looking up. Her voice was light, distracted. "I won," I said. "That's wonderful, sweetie," she replied automatically, adjusting a hemline. Then she added, "I'm so sorry we couldn't make it." Sophie had her dance fitting, and you know how hard those appointments are to get. Sophie grinned at me from across the room. "You should have seen the fabric, Nadia. It's imported from Italy." What?" I forced a smile. "That's great." Dad looked up briefly from his recliner, eyes flicking toward the trophy in my hands. "First place, huh? Good for you." He gave a small nod and went back to reading the newspaper. That was it. No hug. No photo. Not even a space on the shelf for the trophy. Dinner that night was quiet. The air smelled faintly of glue and roasted chicken. Sophie chattered about her upcoming recital, and Mom kept reminding her to practice her turns. When there was finally a pause long enough for me to speak, I said softly, "They took a picture of me at the fair." Mom smiled, distracted. "That's nice, honey. Maybe we can frame it later." She didn't ask to see it. Afterward, I washed the dishes while Sophie practiced in the hallway. Her music echoed through the walls, bright, confident, certain of being heard. I dried my hands, went to my room, and placed the little trophy on my desk beside the notebook from my 10th birthday. It looked too small under the yellow light, like an object out of place. I opened the notebook to a clean page and wrote the first line that came to mind. If silence had a sound, it would echo like this. The graphite left a faint shine on the paper. I stared at the sentence for a long time, tracing each letter with my fingertip. It didn't feel bitter, it felt like truth. The kind you don't say out loud, because no one would know what to do with it. When I turned off the lamp, the room fell into a soft darkness. From down the hall, I could still hear Sophie's laughter and Mom's voice counting beats, the muffled rhythm of a life happening elsewhere. I lay in bed and imagined the wind turning the blades of my little turbine, spinning faithfully in an empty gym somewhere, generating light no one would ever notice. A few weeks after the science fair, Grandma Lillian came to visit. She was the kind of woman whose presence filled a room without ever raising her voice, a quiet force, wrapped in soft wool sweaters and the scent of cinnamon tea. She'd always been more of an observer than a talker, and that afternoon, she watched me from the porch swing as I tinkered with a half-broken radio. The spring air smelled of cut grass and rain, and I could feel her gaze before she spoke. "You're always fixing things, aren't you?" she said, her voice calm but knowing. I nodded, wiping a smudge of oil from my fingers. "They don't stay fixed for long," I admitted. "Maybe not," she said, "but that doesn't make it any less brave to try." When she left the next morning, she handed me a small wrapped parcel tied with an old ribbon. "This was mine when I was about your age," she said. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, the cover soft and worn at the corners, faintly smelling of cedar and ink. She brushed her fingers across the gold-edged pages. "I used to write in it whenever I forgot who I was. It helped me remember." Her eyes softened, and I saw in them something that made my chest tighten, a kind of recognition. As if she understood without needing to ask. "Keep it safe," she said. "And when the world gets too loud, write until it sounds like you again." That notebook became my anchor. At night, I'd sit by the small desk near my window, the lamplight falling over the pages, and write about things I couldn't say aloud, the sound of my parents' laughter drifting from Sophie's room, the way Dad always forgot which subject I loved, the way Mom only seemed proud of things she could photograph. Writing was the only place I didn't have to shrink myself to fit. Every page was a rebellion made of sentences. By the time I reached high school, I had grown used to being the girl in the background. I did well in classes, volunteered at the library, and helped Sophie study for her exams when she panicked. She was the performer, the one everyone expected to succeed, while I was the planner, the one who made sure nothing fell apart. My teachers liked me, but not in the way they adored her. I never made a scene, never demanded attention. Until the day Mr. Reeves noticed me. He was my sophomore English teacher, a man with kind eyes and a coffee mug permanently stained around the rim. One afternoon, he handed back our essays on the topic, The Price of Silence in Modern Society. I'd written mine the night before, pouring every bit of myself into it without realizing it. When he placed the paper on my desk, I saw a single sentence scrawled in red ink at the top. "See me after class." I stayed behind while everyone else shuffled out, heart hammering. He leaned against his desk, holding my essay in one hand. "This," he said, waving the pages slightly, "isn't just an assignment. It's a voice." I opened my mouth, unsure how to respond, but he continued. "You write like someone who's seen things she's not supposed to talk about. That's not bad, Nadia, it's brave." I stared at him, speechless. No one had ever described my words that way before. He flipped to the last page, tapping his pen against a paragraph. "You think small because they make you feel small," he said gently. "But you don't belong in the corner of the room. You belong where people can hear you." I felt something catch in my throat, like a door quietly unlocking. "You ever think about applying to a top university?" he asked. "Stanford, maybe. Or Harvard. Somewhere that lets you stretch." I laughed nervously. "Stanford? That's impossible. We don't even know anyone who's gone there." He smiled, unfazed. "Every student I've ever seen reach something big started by thinking it was impossible. I'll write you a recommendation if you ever decide to try." That night, I wrote about the conversation in Grandma's notebook. The words flowed like water. He said I belong where people can hear me. I don't know what that means yet. Maybe someday I will. I kept reading that line over and over, as if repetition could make me believe it. When I told my parents about Mr. Reeves's suggestion, Mom laughed lightly. "Stanford? That's all the way in California, honey. We can't afford that kind of dream." Dad added without looking up from his phone, "It's good to be realistic. Maybe look at local colleges first. Sophie might want to use the car next year, and we'll need to plan around that." Sophie, curled on the couch, smirked. "California's for movie stars, Nadia, not math nerds." "Aw." I pretended to shrug it off, but later that night, I sat at my desk, the Stanford website glowing on my laptop screen. The campus photos looked unreal, sunlight spilling through palm trees, red-tiled roofs against blue sky, students walking under stone arches with notebooks in hand. It felt like a different universe, one where people like me might finally be seen. I opened Grandma's notebook and pressed my pen to the page. Maybe impossible just means something no one else in this house has tried yet. The ink bled a little, dark and steady. Over the following months, I worked harder than I ever had. I stayed after school, joined the debate team, entered essay competitions, anything that let my voice exist outside the walls of our living room. Mr. Reeves kept his promise. "I'll be your first letter of recommendation," he said one afternoon, handing me an envelope with his signature already scrawled across the flap. I didn't know then that this single act would change everything. When Grandma visited again that summer, I showed her the envelope and told her about my dream. She smiled, proud and wistful all at once. "Stanford," she said softly, as if tasting the word. "You'll like it there. Lots of room for big thoughts." Then she reached out, touching my cheek. "They won't understand right away, Nadia. People rarely do when you outgrow their version of you. But don't let that stop you. Write your story, even if you have to write it alone. That night, I fell asleep with her notebook open beside me, the faint smell of cedar in the air, and for the first time in my life, I felt something new blooming quietly inside me, not rebellion, not even hope. It was resolve. The first time I saw Palm Drive, the sun was setting behind the row of palm trees that stretched endlessly toward the heart of Stanford. Everything glowed gold and red, the color of a dream that had finally taken shape. I stood there for a moment with my suitcase beside me, the warm wind carrying the faint scent of eucalyptus and new beginnings. In the distance, Hoover Tower rose like a watchful guardian, its bell echoing softly through the campus. My hands were shaking. Months of essays, interviews, and late-night applications had somehow led me here. When I stepped through the arched gate, I whispered under my breath, "You made it." Not loud enough for anyone to hear, just enough for the version of me who once hid behind Sophie's spotlight to know she'd survived. Move-in day was chaos. Families posed for photos under the Stanford arch, parents cried into each other's shoulders, and students hugged like they already knew they'd remember this moment forever. I stood a little apart from it all, clutching the worn leather notebook Grandma Lillian had given me. My parents hadn't come, of course. The night before, Mom had said she'd try to drive down after Sophie's dance showcase, but I knew she wouldn't. "You're independent," she'd said, like it was praise. It sounded more like a reason not to show up. My roommate, Leah Patel, arrived late that afternoon dragging 3 mismatched suitcases and a guitar case. She burst into the room with her hair tied up in a messy bun and music spilling from her earbuds. "Hi, I'm Leah. Oh my God, we have the good view." She pointed to the window overlooking the main quad, then turned to me. "You're Nadia, right? I read your name on the door. Pretty handwriting. You seem calm, please tell me you're calm." "I need a calm roommate." I laughed, startled by how easy she was to like. Leah had this way of filling silence without crowding it. By dinner, we'd already shared half our life stories and a bag of instant ramen cooked in the communal kitchen. It tasted like salt and exhaustion, but I don't think I'd ever felt more content. The weeks that followed were a blur of discovery. The mornings smelled of coffee and ambition. Students rushed between Green Library, Memorial Church, and the engineering quad, their faces bright with purpose. I fell into rhythm quickly: lectures in the day, part-time shifts at the library in the evenings, problem sets that stretched past midnight. Sometimes I'd walk across the oval just to breathe, the stars above sharp and clear like the promises I'd made to myself. I had a life now, one that no one back home could imagine. But the pride I felt was always shadowed by something quieter, a loneliness that crept in when the campus went still. There were moments when the glow of achievement didn't reach me, when everyone seemed to belong to some invisible circle I wasn't part of. On weekends, Leah's parents called to check in. I could hear her laughing through the thin dorm walls. I'd put in my earbuds and pretend to listen to music while reading through data science textbooks, each formula another way to build order out of the chaos of being unseen. At the library, I shelved books until my hands ached, my ID card hanging from a frayed red lanyard. I liked the silence there, the smell of paper and dust, the way sound softened against the high ceilings. It reminded me of the quiet that used to hurt, only now it felt different. This silence was mine. Sometimes, after closing hours, I'd sit by the big window overlooking the courtyard, open Grandma's notebook, and write. I built a life no one cared to see, but it's still mine. Leah and I grew close over the months. She was studying sociology and had a laugh that could shake the whole room. On nights when exhaustion hit me hard, she'd toss me a cup of instant coffee and say, "Come on, Mitchell. No one gets to change the world on an empty stomach." She told me about her family, loud, loving, full of arguments and affection, and I told her about Oregon, about Sophie, about how I used to write because it was the only place I could exist. She listened without pity, which made me trust her even more. One night, she said, "You know what I like about you, Nadia? You build things. Not just machines or code, you build ways to survive." There were other people who noticed me too, professors who saw potential, classmates who admired my precision, but I never quite let my guard down. Success felt fragile, like something that could vanish if I looked away too long. Every late-night breakthrough was a quiet act of defiance, proof that I could matter without anyone's permission. Still, sometimes, I'd catch sight of parents visiting campus carrying care packages, taking photos under the arches, and feel that familiar ache. When Leah's mom sent me a small box of cookies after hearing I'd aced an exam, I almost cried. I thanked her, of course, but what I really wanted to say was, I didn't know love could be that simple. Winter came softly that first year, the trees along Palm Drive turning pale gold before the rain set in. One evening, walking back from class under my umbrella, I passed Memorial Church just as the choir was rehearsing. Their voices floated through the open doors, warm and resonant. I stopped, watching the light spill out across the wet stone. For a second, I wished my family could see this, not to impress them, but to prove that I was here, living a life that was both beautiful and hard. Then I realized it didn't matter if they ever did. The proof was in me, in the fact that I kept showing up, even when no one else did. By the end of that first year, my world had grown bigger than I ever thought possible. Yet, late at night, when the campus lights dimmed and everyone else was asleep, I'd still whisper the same thing I did on that first day at the gate. You made it. Sometimes I said it like a victory. Other times, like a prayer. It was during my second year that I met Professor Gabriel Alvarez, the man who would unknowingly change the direction of my life. I'd enrolled in his course, Ethics and Algorithms, mostly out of curiosity. The room was always full: engineers, sociologists, even medical students, all drawn by his way of making data sound like poetry. He had a quiet intensity, the kind that made people lean forward when he spoke. One afternoon, after class, he stopped me as I was packing my bag. You wrote in your paper, he said, flipping through the pages, technology should never decide who gets to be seen. What did you mean by that? I froze for a moment, unsure if it was a trick question. I began cautiously. That code is written by people, and people carry bias. If we don't check it, we end up amplifying invisibility instead of fixing it. He smiled then, slow and approving. That's a better answer than most graduate students give. I'm starting a small research project this quarter, AI for medical equity. We're studying how to use data to distribute medical supplies fairly in rural clinics across California. Interested? I said yes before I even understood what I was signing up for. That week, I joined a small, mismatched group of students, 2 engineers, a med student, and me huddled in a lab that smelled faintly of solder and burnt coffee. Professor Alvarez told us the goal was simple but urgent. During wildfires and droughts, medical supplies often got stuck in the same bottleneck: too much in wealthy areas, not enough where people were dying. We're building an algorithm, he said, that listens to the people who never get heard. The phrase hit me like a pulse. For the first time, coding didn't feel mechanical, it felt human. The early days were messy. We spent nights staring at spreadsheets, arguing over models, drinking lukewarm coffee from vending machines. I wasn't the loudest in the room, but I was the one who stayed the latest. Slowly, Professor Alvarez began to rely on me for the details others overlooked. You see the edges, he told me once. That's where fairness hides. As the semester rolled on, I found myself leading small tasks, then meetings, then eventually the entire coordination between the engineering and medical sides. It wasn't about ambition, it was survival, the same instinct that had kept me moving my whole life. I'd learned how to hold things together when no one else noticed the cracks. Now, that skill finally mattered. Leah would joke about it constantly. You bend, but you don't break, she said one night as we sat on the dorm floor surrounded by half-eaten pizza and open laptops. You're like a human rubber band. Do you ever rest? I smiled. Rest is expensive. She looked at me, eyes softening. One day, you'll learn that it's okay to be proud out loud. Maybe she was right, But at that time, pride still felt like a luxury, something I hadn't earned permission for. Our project gained attention faster than any of us expected. A local health nonprofit heard about it and offered to pilot the algorithm in 2 rural clinics. The first time I saw our program actually allocate resources, insulin, antibiotics, masks to the places that needed them most, something inside me shifted. It wasn't like winning a competition or acing an exam. It was quieter, deeper. I'd helped make something that saw people. When the results came in, Professor Alvarez called me into his office. His walls were lined with books and old photographs, hospitals, protests, faces of people whose stories had become statistics. He gestured for me to sit. "You remind me of someone," he said. "A student I once had who thought she had to earn her right to exist in every room. She burned herself out proving she belonged." He paused, his gaze steady. "Don't do that, Nadia. You already belong." I didn't know what to say, so I nodded. But that night, walking back along Palm Drive, I thought about his words for a long time. Belonging wasn't something I'd ever felt was given to me, it was something I built, piece by piece, like a machine that only worked if I never stopped turning the gears. The next year, I became president of the Women in Tech organization. The irony wasn't lost on me. The girl who once hid in the library now leading workshops on confidence and leadership. I stood in front of rooms full of women who looked like me, who spoke softly, who apologized before speaking, and I told them, "You don't have to be loud to be heard. You just have to keep showing up." Every time I said it, I felt like I was speaking to my younger self. Leah came to nearly every event, cheering louder than anyone else. "Look at you," she said one evening, her grin wide as we walked back to the dorm. "You're helping girls find their voices while pretending you haven't found yours." I laughed, shaking my head. "I'm still figuring out what it sounds like." "Whatever it is," she said, bumping my shoulder, "it's worth turning the volume up." The project with Professor Alvarez grew beyond campus. News outlets picked it up, calling it the Fair Supply Initiative. Donations poured in. We expanded our pilot